On a frigid February morning in 1979, security personnel at the World Trade Center's North Tower discovered something impossible. $4.4 million in negotiable securities, bearer bonds, and cash had disappeared from a supposedly impenetrable storage facility on the 63rd floor. No alarms had been triggered. No doors had been forced open. No windows had been broken. The vault showed no signs of tampering whatsoever. For 23 years, this theft remained one of New York City's most baffling unsolved crimes. Federal investigators pursued hundreds of leads across multiple states. They interviewed over 2,000 people. They analyzed security footage until the tapes wore thin. Yet despite the massive scale of the operation and the shocking audacity of the crime, the perpetrator seemed to have vanished into thin air, along with the money. The case grew cold. Detectives retired. Files gathered dust in FBI storage facilities. The World Trade Center continued its daily operations, and the mystery faded from public consciousness, becoming just another footnote in the city's long history of spectacular crimes. But in 2002, everything changed. A 58-year-old man named Jerome Williams walked into a Catholic church in Asheville, North Carolina, sat down in a confessional booth, and unburdened himself of a secret he had carried for more than 2 decades. What followed was a confession that would shock investigators, reveal an almost perfect crime, and demonstrate how one ordinary man had managed to fool some of the most sophisticated security systems of his era. Jerome Williams had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. For 23 years, he lived a quiet, unremarkable life as a property manager in the Blue Ridge Mountains, never spending lavishly, never drawing attention to himself, never giving anyone reason to suspect that he was sitting on a fortune stolen from the heart of Manhattan's financial district. His patience had been extraordinary. His discipline had been absolute, and his eventual confession would reveal a level of planning and execution that left even seasoned FBI agents grudgingly impressed. This is the story of how a trusted maintenance supervisor spent 18 months studying every inch of the World Trade Center's security infrastructure, exploited a single weekend of system upgrades to execute a flawless theft, and then disappeared into American anonymity for more than 2 decades before his conscience finally caught up with him. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Jerome Williams was born in Brooklyn in 1944, the youngest of 3 children in a working-class family. His father worked as a janitor for the New York City school system. His mother cleaned houses in Park Slope. From an early age, Jerome understood the value of hard work and the bitter reality of economic struggle. He watched his parents labor for decades, their bodies breaking down, their savings account never growing beyond a few $1,000s. After graduating from Thomas Jefferson High School in 1962, Jerome enlisted in the Army. He served 4 years, including a tour in Germany where he worked as a building maintenance specialist. The military taught him discipline, attention to detail, and perhaps most importantly, how complex security systems functioned. He learned to read blueprints, understand electrical schematics, and diagnose mechanical problems. These skills would prove invaluable years later. When Jerome returned to civilian life in 1966, he found work with a commercial building maintenance company in Manhattan. He was good at his job, reliable and thorough. Supervisors praised his technical knowledge and his ability to solve problems that stumped other workers. By 1972, he had been promoted to shift supervisor, overseeing a crew of 12 maintenance workers. In 1975, Jerome's company won a major contract with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They would provide maintenance services for the World Trade Center complex, the gleaming twin towers that had become symbols of American economic power. For Jerome, it was a prestigious assignment. For his employer, it was a lucrative deal worth hundreds of thousands annually. Neither party could have anticipated what would eventually unfold. Jerome's personal life during these years appeared stable, but was quietly unraveling. He had married his high school sweetheart, Patricia, in 1965. They had 2 daughters, born in 1967 and 1970. But by the mid-1970s, the marriage was strained. Patricia had been diagnosed with lupus, and the medical bills were crushing. Their insurance covered only a fraction of the costs. Jerome worked overtime constantly, but the debt kept growing. By 1977, they owed nearly $60,000 to various hospitals and specialists, an astronomical sum for a maintenance supervisor earning $22,000 per year. Jerome never complained to his co-workers. He showed up every day, did his job with his characteristic precision, and kept his financial desperation private. But inside, he was drowning. He lay awake at night, calculating impossible mathematics, trying to figure out how to pay for his wife's treatments, while keeping food on the table and a roof over his family's heads. The pressure was suffocating. It was during this period of quiet desperation that Jerome began to notice things about the World Trade Center that other people overlooked. As a maintenance supervisor, he had access to virtually every part of the complex. He knew which doors led where, which security cameras were functional and which were merely decorative deterrents, which guards were attentive and which ones spent their shifts reading newspapers. He understood the building's rhythms, its patterns, its vulnerabilities. The 63rd floor of the North Tower housed administrative offices for several financial firms. More importantly, it contained a secure storage facility where these firms kept physical securities, bonds, and occasionally large amounts of cash during transfers between institutions. The vault itself was impressive, with thick steel walls and a time-locked door. But Jerome noticed something that security consultants had apparently missed. The vault's ventilation system connected to the building's main HVAC infrastructure. This was necessary to prevent moisture buildup that could damage the paper securities stored inside. The ductwork was standard industrial gauge, far too small for a person to crawl through. But the system's control panel was located in a maintenance closet 3 rooms away from the vault itself. And that control panel, Jerome realized, wasn't monitored by any security system. He began to observe more carefully. During his regular maintenance rounds, he would note the timing of guard patrols, the rotation schedules, the days when certain supervisors were on duty versus others. He noticed that security was significantly reduced on weekends, particularly during overnight hours. He observed which cleaning crews worked which floors and when they took their breaks. Jerome started arriving at work an hour early and staying an hour late. Nobody questioned this. He was known as a dedicated employee. What his co-workers didn't know was that he was using this extra time to study the building's security infrastructure in meticulous detail. He made mental notes of camera angles and blind spots. He timed how long it took guards to complete their rounds. He tested doors to see which ones were truly locked and which ones merely appeared to be. In the summer of 1978, Jerome learned something that would transform his careful observations into a concrete plan. The Port Authority was planning a comprehensive upgrade of the World Trade Center's security systems. The project would take 18 months and would involve replacing outdated equipment, installing new cameras, and updating the computer systems that monitored access to secure areas. During the transition period, there would inevitably be gaps in coverage, as old systems were deactivated before new ones came online. Jerome volunteered to serve as the maintenance liaison for the security upgrade project. His supervisors were pleased. It was exactly the kind of additional responsibility that Jerome was known for accepting. What they didn't realize was that this position gave him access to detailed information about which systems would be offline on which dates, which areas would be vulnerable during installations, and exactly when the maximum security gaps would occur. He spent months studying the project timeline. He obtained copies of the installation schedules, ostensibly to coordinate maintenance work around the security upgrades. He attended planning meetings and asked technical questions that made him seem like a conscientious employee concerned about minimizing disruptions. All the while, he was building a complete mental map of when and where the building would be most vulnerable. By December 1978, Jerome had identified his window of opportunity. On the weekend of February 10th and 11th, 1979, contractors would be replacing the security system control panels on floors 60 through 70 of the North Tower. During this replacement, the backup systems would also be temporarily offline for testing. There would be a period of approximately 8 hours from midnight Saturday until 8 Sunday morning when security coverage on those floors would be reduced to basic guard patrols and nothing more. Jerome's plan was audacious in its simplicity. He would use his legitimate access to enter the building during his regular shift. He would carry out the theft during the security gap, and he would exit the building the same way he entered, as a maintenance supervisor completing routine weekend work. No breaking and entering, no sophisticated alarm bypasses, no dramatic escapes, just a trusted employee exploiting a temporary vulnerability that only he fully understood. The preparation was meticulous. Jerome began squirreling away equipment from the maintenance supply rooms. A heavy-duty bolt cutter, ostensibly for removing old security fixtures. A portable welding torch, supposedly for repairs to metal door frames. A large rolling maintenance cart with a false bottom he constructed himself during slow night shifts. Each item disappeared gradually, never all at once, never in quantities that would trigger inventory concerns. He practiced every movement. During legitimate weekend maintenance shifts in January, he timed how long it took to move from one floor to another using the service elevators. He rehearsed opening and closing the maintenance closet near the vault. He even practiced his demeanor, perfecting the exhausted, slightly bored expression of a maintenance worker pulling yet another tedious weekend shift. Jerome also prepared his exit strategy with equal care. He opened a safety deposit box at a bank in White Plains, paying cash for the rental and using false identification he had purchased through a contact from his army days. He researched cities in the southeastern United States, where a black man with maintenance skills could find work without drawing attention. He studied how to convert bearer bonds into cash through intermediaries, learning the techniques that criminals had used for decades. His wife, Patricia, knew nothing. His daughters knew nothing. His co-workers noticed only that Jerome seemed slightly more stressed than usual, but they attributed this to his wife's worsening health. Nobody suspected that the quiet, reliable maintenance supervisor was planning to commit one of the largest thefts in New York City history. The weekend of February 10th arrived cold and grey. Snow had fallen the previous Tuesday, and the streets of Lower Manhattan were lined with blackened slush. Jerome kissed his wife goodbye Saturday morning, told her he had to work another weekend shift because of the security upgrades, and drove his aging Chevy Nova into the city. He arrived at the World Trade Center at 3 in the afternoon, his usual start time for weekend work. He signed in at the security desk. The guard barely looked up. Jerome Williams working a Saturday was as unremarkable as sunrise. He took the service elevator to the maintenance office on the 44th floor, changed into his work uniform, and collected his equipment cart. Then he began what appeared to be a routine inspection of the ventilation systems on the upper floors. At 11:30 that night, Jerome was on the 63rd floor. The corridors were empty except for one security guard making his rounds on the opposite side of the tower. The financial offices were dark. The vault containing millions in securities sat behind its imposing steel door, apparently impregnable. Jerome wheeled his maintenance cart into the utility closet located 3 rooms away from the vault. He had studied the ventilation schematics for months. He knew exactly what needed to be done. Using tools he had carefully selected, he began to disassemble the HVAC control panel. This part was legitimate maintenance work. If anyone checked on him, he could honestly explain that he was performing routine service during the security system upgrade. But what Jerome did next went far beyond routine maintenance. Behind the control panel was access to the main ventilation shaft. Using his bolt cutter, he removed the security grate that normally prevented access to the ductwork. The opening was small, barely 2 feet square, but it led to a much larger chamber within the building's structure, a space between floors where major mechanical systems ran. Jerome had discovered this space months earlier during a routine repair. It was a gap in the building's architecture, a void created by the complex overlapping of ventilation, electrical, and plumbing infrastructure, and it ran directly beneath the vault on the 63rd floor. More importantly, the vault's floor, while thick concrete, rested on a standard steel support grid, the same grid that supported every floor in the building. At 1:15 Sunday morning, Jerome was inside that hidden space, working in near-total darkness with only a small flashlight clenched between his teeth. The temperature was stifling despite the winter cold outside. Sweat poured down his face as he set up his portable welding equipment. He had chosen this particular spot because the construction blueprints indicated that the vault's floor here was actually a removable access panel, installed to allow maintenance on the ventilation system below. It was secured with heavy bolts, but it wasn't the impenetrable barrier that the vault's walls and door represented. The welding torch flared to life. Jerome worked slowly, carefully, cutting through the bolt housings one at a time. Each cut took nearly 15 minutes. The metal glowed orange, then white, then gradually cooled to black. The smell of burning steel filled the cramped space. His back screamed in agony from the awkward position, but his hands remained steady. At 3:47 in the morning, the last bolt gave way. Jerome carefully lifted the access panel upward. Above him was the vault floor, a grid of steel beams supporting concrete. But between those beams was simple sheet metal, installed to prevent debris from falling into the space below, but never intended as a security barrier. Using his bolt cutters, Jerome made quick work of the sheet metal. Within minutes, he had created an opening into the vault itself. He pulled himself up through the hole. His flashlight beam swept across rows of filing cabinets and storage lockers. This was it. This was what 18 months of planning had led to. For a moment, Jerome simply stood there, breathing hard, unable to quite believe that his plan had actually worked. The storage lockers weren't individually alarmed. Why would they be? The vault itself was supposed to be impenetrable. Jerome moved systematically from locker to locker. Many contained documents and securities that would be difficult to liquidate, but several contained bearer bonds, financial instruments that functioned like cash, payable to whoever possessed them. And one locker contained nearly $400,000 in actual currency, apparently awaiting Monday morning transfer between financial institutions. Jerome had brought 4 large canvas bags, the type maintenance workers used for collecting debris. He filled them methodically, taking only the most liquid assets, the items that could be most easily converted to usable money. He ignored gold certificates and stock certificates that would require extensive paperwork to redeem. He focused on bearer bonds and cash. The total value of what he took would later be estimated at $4.4 million. By 5:30 Sunday morning, Jerome was back in the hidden space between floors. He carefully repositioned the access panel, using a temporary welding job that would hold for a few hours but would eventually fail, making the theft look like the panel had simply given way due to age and stress. It was a clever touch, suggesting structural failure rather than deliberate cutting. He made his way back through the ventilation space to the utility closet. The canvas bags went into the false bottom of his maintenance cart, covered by cleaning supplies and tools. He carefully reassembled the HVAC control panel, removing all evidence of his access to the ventilation shaft. By 6:45 he was back in the maintenance office, drinking coffee and completing fake paperwork about ventilation system inspections on floors 60 through 70. At 7:30, the day shift security guards arrived. Jerome nodded to them as he prepared to leave. Just another boring weekend shift completed. Nothing unusual to report. He signed out at the security desk, loaded his cart into his van, and drove out of the parking garage into the grey Sunday morning light. The theft wasn't discovered until Monday afternoon. A financial firm employee needed to retrieve documents from the vault and noticed that the floor felt slightly unstable near the back wall. Upon investigation, the access panel's temporary weld had failed completely, revealing the hole beneath. Security was called. The missing bearer bonds and cash were quickly inventoried. Within hours, the FBI had been notified of a major theft. The investigation was immediate and massive. Special Agent Richard Kowalski of the FBI's New York field office led a task force of 12 agents. They interviewed every person who had accessed that floor during the previous week. They reviewed every frame of security footage, trying to identify anyone who had behaved suspiciously. They analyzed the welding marks, trying to determine what kind of equipment had been used. Jerome Williams was interviewed twice during the initial investigation. He explained that yes, he had been working on the 63rd floor that weekend, performing routine ventilation maintenance during the security upgrade. His sign-in logs confirmed this. His supervisor vouched for him. Nothing in his background suggested he was capable of sophisticated theft. His financial records showed he was struggling with medical debt, but so were millions of Americans. The investigators found no evidence linking him to the crime. What they didn't know was that Jerome had spent the previous Sunday afternoon moving everything to his safety deposit box in White Plains. The bearer bonds sat in that anonymous metal box, along with the cash, waiting patiently for the right time to be converted and moved. Jerome's plan required patience above all else. He knew that immediately trying to cash the bonds would trigger red flags across the financial system. He needed to wait. For months after the theft, Jerome continued working at the World Trade Center. This was perhaps the most audacious part of his plan. While FBI agents combed through evidence and pursued leads, Jerome showed up for his shifts, did his job with his usual competence, and gave no indication whatsoever that his life had changed. He continued to worry publicly about his wife's medical bills. He continued to drive his aging car and wear cheap clothes. Nothing changed in his outward appearance. In July 1979, Jerome submitted his resignation. He explained that his wife's condition was worsening and that they needed to move to a drier climate. His doctors had recommended Arizona or New Mexico. His supervisor was sorry to lose such a reliable employee, but understood completely. There was a small going-away party in the maintenance office. Co-workers signed a card wishing the Williams family well. Jerome shook hands, accepted their good wishes, and walked out of the World Trade Center for the last time. But the Williams family didn't move to the Southwest. Instead, Jerome, Patricia, and their 2 daughters relocated to Asheville, North Carolina. Jerome had chosen the city carefully. It was large enough to offer anonymity, but small enough that a skilled maintenance worker could find steady employment without extensive background checks. The climate was mild enough to potentially help Patricia's condition, and most importantly, it was far enough from New York to make casual connections unlikely. In Asheville, Jerome became Jerry Watson. He had obtained genuine social security numbers for himself and his family through a contact who specialized in helping people disappear, a Vietnam veteran who understood how to navigate the gaps in bureaucratic systems. The identification wasn't stolen or fabricated. It was real documentation for people who had never really existed. A ghost family overlaid perfectly onto the Williams family's real identities. Jerry Watson found work as a property manager for a small apartment complex in West Asheville. The pay was modest but sufficient. He and Patricia rented a small house on Haywood Road. Their daughters enrolled in local schools under their new names. To anyone who asked, they were a family from Virginia, relocating for Patricia's health. Nobody questioned the story. The bearer bonds remained untouched for 3 years. Jerome had researched extensively and knew that immediately liquidating them would trigger investigations. Instead, he waited. He lived on his property manager's salary, supplemented occasionally by small amounts of the stolen cash. Spent carefully and gradually, he maintained the same frugal lifestyle he had always lived. His neighbors saw a quiet, hard-working black man who kept his lawn trimmed and his house maintained. There was nothing remarkable about Jerry Watson. In 1982, Jerome finally began the careful process of converting the bearer bonds into usable assets. He worked through intermediaries, financial brokers operating in grey legal areas who specialized in handling securities without asking uncomfortable questions. The process took 2 years and consumed nearly 30% of the bond's value in fees and commissions. But gradually, Jerome converted his stolen fortune into legitimate investments under his false identity. He purchased a modest home in a middle-class neighborhood, Not too nice, not too shabby. He bought a newer car, but nothing flashy. A reliable Toyota that wouldn't draw attention. He invested in Patricia's medical care, but through clinics and doctors that accepted cash payments, avoiding the insurance paper trails that might trigger investigations. Every decision was calculated to maintain his cover as an ordinary working man of modest means. The FBI investigation continued for years, but leads gradually dried up. Without witnesses and with only minimal physical evidence, the case grew cold. Special Agent Kowalski retired in 1987, still frustrated by the unsolved theft. The case files were moved to storage. Younger agents inherited the open case but had little to work with beyond the original evidence. The mysterious World Trade Center theft became a historical footnote, occasionally mentioned in FBI training sessions as an example of an almost perfect inside job. Jerome's life in Asheville settled into comfortable routine. He changed jobs several times, always in property management or maintenance work, always maintaining his Jerry Watson identity. His daughters graduated from high school, knowing nothing of their father's past. Patricia's health stabilized somewhat in North Carolina's milder climate, though the disease continued its slow progression. To all outward appearances, the Watson family was exactly what they seemed. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. But internally, Jerome carried a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. The initial fear of being caught gradually gave way to something more corrosive. Guilt. Not for stealing from wealthy financial institutions, he had rationalized that long ago, but guilt for the lie he had forced his family to live. His daughters grew up with false names and fabricated histories. Patricia never questioned the sudden move or the new identity. But Jerome knew she suspected something. The unspoken truth sat between them like a wall. In 1994, Patricia died from complications of lupus. She was only 50 years old. Jerome stood at her graveside in Asheville's Memorial Park, listening to the preacher who knew his family as the Watsons, and felt the full weight of 15 years of deception. His wife had lived half her adult life as someone else, all because of a choice he had made alone in a moment of desperation. After Patricia's death, Jerome withdrew even further into himself. His daughters had moved away, pursuing their own lives, still unaware of the truth. He continued working, now managing a small shopping complex, but his heart wasn't in it. The money he had stolen and carefully invested had grown over the years. He had enough to retire comfortably, but retirement meant time alone with his thoughts, and that prospect terrified him. The years passed. The new millennium arrived. The World Trade Center towers fell on September 11, 2001, and Jerome watched the footage on television with complicated emotions. He had worked in those buildings. He knew their corridors and service areas. He had committed his great crime in those towers. Now they were gone, along with thousands of innocent people. The national tragedy seemed to underscore the moral weight of his own private sin. In early 2002, Jerome began attending services at St. Lawrence Catholic Church in downtown Asheville. He wasn't Catholic, hadn't been particularly religious before, but something drew him to the church's quiet sanctuary. He started going to weekday morning masses when the church was nearly empty. He found a strange comfort in the ritual and the silence. On March 19, 2002, Jerome entered the church and walked directly to the confessional booth. A young priest, Father Michael Brennan, was hearing confessions that afternoon. Jerome sat in the darkened booth and began to speak. He spoke for nearly an hour, describing in detail the theft he had committed 23 years earlier, the life he had built on stolen money, the false identity he had maintained for over 2 decades. Father Brennan listened without interruption. When Jerome finished, there was a long silence. Then the priest spoke. The seal of confession was absolute, he explained. He could not and would not break it, but he urged Jerome to consider turning himself in, not for legal reasons, but for spiritual ones. The burden Jerome carried would not lift until he faced the truth of what he had done. Jerome left the church that day without making any promises, but something had shifted. He had spoken the truth aloud for the first time in 23 years. The secret that had lived inside him alone was now shared, even if only with a priest bound by sacred vow to silence. 3 weeks later, Jerome Williams walked into the FBI field office in Asheville. He asked to speak to someone about an old case from New York. The agent who took his initial statement was skeptical. They got occasional confessions from people with mental health issues claiming responsibility for famous crimes. But as Jerome began describing details that had never been made public, details about the vault's ventilation system and the access panel and the specific types of bearer bonds stolen, the agent's skepticism turned to shock. Within hours, agents from the FBI's New York field office were on the phone. Files from storage were retrieved and dusted off. Details of Jerome's confession were checked against case evidence. Everything matched. After 23 years, the World Trade Center theft had been solved by the perpetrator's own voluntary confession. Jerome waived his right to remain silent and gave a complete statement. He explained his motivation, his planning process, the execution of the theft, and his subsequent years in hiding. He provided documentation of his false identity and detailed financial records showing how he had converted and invested the stolen money. He offered to cooperate fully with recovering whatever remained of the funds. The legal process that followed was complex. Jerome was charged with theft, fraud, and multiple counts of identity-related crimes, but prosecutors faced an unusual situation. The defendant was volunteering complete cooperation. He showed genuine remorse, and importantly, the statute of limitations on some charges had expired, while others were complicated by the fact that some of the financial institutions he had stolen from no longer existed, having been absorbed by other banks during the mergers of the 1980s and 1990s. In December 2002, Jerome Williams pleaded guilty to federal theft and fraud charges. The judge, noting his voluntary confession and complete cooperation, sentenced him to 8 years in federal prison, far less than the maximum sentence the charges could have carried. Jerome also agreed to forfeit all remaining assets purchased with the stolen money, approximately $2.1 million in cash and investments. The rest had been spent over the years on medical care, living expenses, and the fees paid to intermediaries who had helped him disappear. Jerome served 5 years before being released on parole in 2007. He returned to Asheville, this time under his real name, and found work doing maintenance at a local community college. His daughters, who had learned the truth during the trial, struggled to reconcile the father they had known with the criminal he had been. The relationship was strained but not severed entirely. The World Trade Center theft joined the ranks of solved cold cases, a cautionary tale about how even sophisticated security systems contain vulnerabilities that can be exploited by someone with sufficient patience, access, and technical knowledge. The investigation revealed that the access panel Jerome had used had been a known weak point in the vault's design, but budget constraints and bureaucratic inertia had prevented its reinforcement. For security professionals, the case became a teaching example. No system is impenetrable. The greatest vulnerabilities often come not from external attackers, but from trusted insiders who understand systems thoroughly. The crime demonstrated that the best security combines technology with vigilant oversight of the people who maintain that technology. Jerome Williams died in 2015 at the age of 71. He had lived his final years quietly, attending church regularly, working his modest job, and maintaining a low profile. In a final interview with a local journalist, he was asked if he regretted the theft. His answer was complicated. He regretted the lie his family had lived. He regretted the years spent looking over his shoulder. He regretted the burden of his secret. But he struggled to regret the act itself, because without that money, his wife would have died years earlier, unable to afford the treatments that extended her life. It was a morally ambiguous legacy for a crime that had seemed so clear-cut on paper. $4.4 million stolen from the financial heart of New York City. A brilliant plan executed almost perfectly. 23 years of successful hiding. And finally, a confession born not from being caught, but from the unbearable weight of living a lie. the case remains a testament to both human ingenuity and human conscience. Jerome Williams proved that with enough patience and inside knowledge, even the most secure facilities can be compromised. But he also proved that some burdens, no matter how successfully carried, eventually become too heavy to bear alone. In the end, it wasn't FBI investigators or security improvements or forensic breakthroughs that solved the World Trade Center theft. It was one man's need to finally speak the truth, to step out from behind the false identity he had worn for more than half his life, and to face the consequences of a choice made long ago in a moment of desperate need. The aftermath of Jerome Williams's confession sent ripples through the security industry that extended far beyond the physical loss of $4.4 million. Insurance companies that had paid out claims related to the theft demanded reviews of similar facilities nationwide. Security consultants were hired to examine maintenance access points in high-security buildings across the country, looking for vulnerabilities that resembled the one Jerome had exploited. What they discovered was troubling. Hundreds of supposedly secure facilities, from bank vaults to museum storage rooms to government archives, had similar weaknesses in their designs. Maintenance access points, ventilation systems, and utility corridors had been installed with functionality in mind, but without sufficient consideration for security implications. The construction boom of the 1960s and 1970s had created countless buildings where form followed function, but security was often an afterthought. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey commissioned a comprehensive study of building security vulnerabilities. The resulting report, completed in 2003, led to significant changes in how secure facilities were designed and maintained. New protocols required that all maintenance access points near high-security areas be monitored electronically. Background checks for maintenance personnel were expanded and deepened. The principle of dual verification was implemented, requiring 2 separate employees to be present for certain types of maintenance work in sensitive locations. Jerome's case also influenced how law enforcement approached cold case investigations. His voluntary confession demonstrated that some criminals, particularly those who had successfully evaded capture, eventually cracked under the psychological pressure of their secrets. Some FBI field offices began programs reaching out through religious institutions and counseling services, creating pathways for criminals to come forward without immediate arrest, hoping to solve other long-dormant cases through similar confessions of conscience. The human cost, however, remained incalculable. 2 daughters who grew up not knowing their real names, a wife who died carrying someone else's identity, a man who sacrificed his integrity for money, then spent decades discovering that no amount of financial security could purchase peace of mind.